Well, I mean, it's a phrase, but I don't know if it's what that means.
It's what it means in my head.
As long as it's in your head. Hello, and welcome to the Roots for Renewal podcast, episode 7.
7?
7? I'm Abby.
And I'm Phil.
And so far we've been looking at the roots that are to do with the daily practice of prayer. And this week we're looking more at our kind of weekly rhythms and a subject which we're both really passionate about, isn't it? The life-giving practice of Sabbath.
Yes, love Sabbath. So we find that Sabbath has a prominent place right the way through Scripture, and it's something that's really important. And we find it first, we learn about it really in the Ten Commandments, something I think most people have heard of. And we find out in the Ten Commandments that it's a holy day, it's a blessed day, it's a day that's devoted to God. And it's a day without any work of any kind. So let's explore what that is by just reading together what it says. So this is in Exodus 20, and this is God giving this commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So we see that God sets this pattern in the Ten Commandments for how his people are going to live holy lives. So holy lives in this context is about being distinctive from the rest of the world. The word holy is quite unpopular these days. It has these connotations of holier than thou, and it means I'm super special. But what God was trying to do for his people was to separate them off and say they are distinctive from the rest of the world. And there's loads of things that seem obvious to us in the Ten Commandments. So, like, do not murder, for example.
It's a good one.
And we would say, well, obviously, that's a reasonable thing. But the reason that that's so obvious to us is because this has been written into our culture through many, many, many years, and it stems from the Ten Commandments. And these commandments were countercultural in their day as they were given. They separated God's people into a different category from the rest of the world. So the idea of Sabbath was something about making the people holy, that day of rest was different from what other people would do.
Yeah, the Ten Commandments have shaped our culture, but yet Sabbath isn't something that's well observed, even by a lot of Christians. And Jesus commanded us to observe the Sabbath, just like he commanded us not to murder or steal. So why aren't we taking it seriously?
That's a question I often have thought about, and the first answer is I don't know. I don't know why we, in the church, we don't take Sabbath seriously in the same way that we do commandments not to steal or murder, as you say. Secondly, I think we're shaped by our culture more than we realise. So because our culture in the UK has neglected or rejected even certain parts of the Ten Commandments, it makes it easier for us in the church and those who follow Jesus to do the same. And so when there's still a cultural expectation of it's not right to murder, but there isn't a cultural expectation of Sabbath, we're more easily, should I say, let that go.
Yeah, you see the signs that say open 7 days, don't you?
Yeah, and that's and actually a day of rest is a weakness. It's a sign of that's how people see it. That actually, if you're not going 24/7. It's not. Nobody says 24/6. It's 24/7. You've got to keep going, and like you say, it's a sign of honour to keep working and to never stop. So there are two reasons why I think we don't observe the Sabbath. But thirdly, I think we misunderstand the place of the Sabbath in the Gospels.
Yeah, you see that on the surface, Jesus seems to have quite a lot of negative or critical things to say about the Sabbath. And perhaps that's one of the reasons that people are cautious about it. Yeah. But that's not a particularly good reading of the situation, is it?
No, so I think the best example of this is in Mark chapter 2. So there's this story where Jesus is walking with his disciples on the Sabbath. And they're walking through a grain field. They're walking through a field. And the disciples are picking bits of grain as a snack as they're going along. And then we get these characters, the Pharisees, who appear, and these are like always like the comedy villains. They're like hiding in a bush. You go, ta-da! And then they jump out and they're like, "You're working on the Sabbath," and they accuse the disciples of breaking the Sabbath law because harvesting, if you're a farmer, is work, and therefore they're picking grain, which is like harvesting, and so they said, "You're not allowed to do that on the Sabbath. You're breaking the law." And Jesus' response is to say this: Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, that's Jesus talking about himself, is Lord even over the Sabbath. So we can look at this in a very simple way and actually misinterpret what's taking place. We look at it and say, well, Jesus broke the Sabbath, and he commended his disciples for breaking the Sabbath. Because now that he's on the scene, he's saying, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I get to decide what happens. That's not how things are going to go down anymore. That's not how we're going to work. We're no longer bound to that law. And then he criticised the Pharisees at different points for their observance of the Sabbath. And he was in conflict with them. So if we don't read the situation properly, we can look at that and go, wow, Jesus wasn't a big fan of this. We should leave the idea of Sabbath alone. And I wonder if that is partly why we don't engage with it in the way that maybe we should.
Yeah, and also Jesus said that he'd come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. So how does Jesus fulfill the Sabbath?
Right, so first we have to understand a bit about the Pharisees and who they are. So they're often seen, as given by Abby's excellent example, as like the not comedy, but the villains, the pantomime villains of the piece. But we need to understand what they're about. So if we look at the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, including the Ten Commandments at the heart, but the rest of the law as well, it was God's way of building relationship with his people. And that thing we talked about holiness, of setting his people aside. So God gives the law, and it's a covenant, it's an agreement between God and his people, Israel. And the agreement is, you observe the law, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. The relationship comes through adhering to the covenant that God has put in place. And the deal for Israel was that they would be blessed so that they could be a blessing to the rest of the world. And they understood that if their relationship with God was right, if they kept the covenant, that they would see effectively the redemption of Israel, that they would see that perfect relationship restored with God. And so it became very important that they observed the law. Now, you don't have to read much through the Old Testament to find that Israel strayed from God time and time again. So as a nation, they drifted away. They had kings and rulers who basically didn't observe the law at all. And whenever that happened, God's favour was no longer on the people. And that was bad. Okay. So then we understand this, again, this question of holiness, that if the people would just choose to be holy and to observe the law, then they would be in right relationship with God, and they'd see that redemption that they long for. And so that's what the Pharisees wanted. Okay? The Pharisees wanted to be in right relationship with God. And the way they did that was to become almost like protectors of the law. How can we as a whole community observe law? Because if one person strays away, then it damages our chances of seeing the redemption that we long for and that perfect relationship with God that he's promised.
So the Pharisees, it's coming from a good place, isn't it? They've got good intentions, but they're not quite on the mark, are they?
Yeah, so they took it to an extreme level. So let's take a silly example just to help us get our heads around it. Imagine one of the commandments is this: thou shalt not eat more than 3 donuts a day.
3 is a good number.
Which is reasonable. So the reason that's a good commandment is because it's not good for your health. It's protecting us, and it's a good reason to have boundaries on life. I mean, I've eaten 12 in a day once before, but we won't go into that.
Yeah, let's leave.
Yeah. So God has set the standard. You shall not eat more than 3 donuts a day. And so the Pharisees look at it and say, okay, everyone, no more than 3. And they make sure people, and think, actually, this is a bit dangerous. Let's go back 1. Let's limit ourselves to 2.
Yeah.
In which case, there's no chance that anyone's going to accidentally eat an extra donut because they've lost count or whatever it is. But then they start to worry some more, and they're saying, actually, if we all have one a day, that's much simpler, and it means we're further away from any opportunity that we might break the covenant that we have with God. We don't want to damage that relationship we have with him. And then over time, the Pharisees think, just having donuts is dangerous business. So we're going to ban eating donuts. No one's allowed to eat any donuts in the kingdom of Israel. That is sad. But then that's not enough, because there are still people making donuts and selling donuts. And so if donuts are in the marketplace, then it's a temptation, isn't it? So let's say, right, no one's allowed to bake or fry. No one's allowed to make donuts, however they're made. No one's allowed to make any donuts. And then do you see how it takes it to the next level? And then it's actually the ingredients for donuts. They have the potential for sin and for straying from God. Therefore, if anybody's seen touching any of the ingredients, if you have jam in a little squirty thing, then it's not allowed. So what they did was they built laws of protection around the law to a ridiculous degree, and it was in order to stop that sense of temptation or that danger of straying. But what it did was it became really restrictive. So now all of a sudden, when God says, have some donuts, but just don't have more than 3. They're like, you're not even allowed to think about donuts.
Now all I'm thinking about is donuts.
Yeah.
Should we go back to the grain?
Yes. And the donut. Yeah, back to the grain for the donuts. So the Sabbath commandment is to not work. Okay, so we go back to the scene of Jesus walking through the field with his disciples, and the criticism is that they are farming and harvesting. Because they're picking a bit of grain, and that is breaking the Sabbath, because it's one of those many laws that the Pharisees have added on to the law. God didn't say don't pick a piece of grain and eat it. He said don't work. Yeah. But they're trying to protect that law in order to keep relationship. So now we can see Jesus' words in context. So when he says, so he's not dismissing the Sabbath when he says, I am Lord of the Sabbath, but he says Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he's saying this law is to be a blessing to people. Yes, to put right boundaries on, but it's to bless people and not to limit them and not to be a burden to people. And so observe the law that God has given it in a way that gives life. And that, for me, is what Sabbath is all about. It's putting restrictions on ourselves in order that we might experience more of the fullness of life that God has for us.
So that's the Harris's hard sell on the importance of Sabbath. But we touched on before that the idea of Sabbath is at odds with our kind of culture at the moment. We're so driven as a culture, we're so determined to achieve and to produce something that it's like a badge of honour, isn't it, to not take time off?
Yeah, and speaking from my people, church leaders are the worst for this. And genuinely, if you're a church leader listening to this, then we've got to get serious about Sabbath, about this commandment that God gives us. And in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15 says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Okay, so it's speaking to Israel from the time when they were, as a nation, held captive. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So that's an interesting piece of history. Just remember you slaves. But then the conclusion is, therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Like, remember that you were under tyranny, you were under oppression. And because that was your past experience, your future experiences, observe the Sabbath. That this is to be a reminder to you of your freedom. I think that's really relevant to us today. That we're not slaves to our diaries. We're not slaves to anybody else's expectations, or even to our own expectations of ourselves and our production levels and what we can achieve, how successful we are. For kids today, how famous we are, or whatever it may be. But for 6 days we work hard, and we should work hard, and we should serve God, and we should do whatever we do for employment or voluntary work, we should do with all of our heart, as if we're doing it for Jesus. But on the 7th day, we rest. We honour God, and we relinquish control, and we say, God, I don't make this world spin round, you do. I didn't create all this, you did. It can happen without me.
Yeah, and we found it to be really life-giving, haven't we?
Yeah.
So let's have a look at how we can actually build this into our lives. So a 24-hour period, when is Sabbath?
So for Jewish believers, it would be from sort of sundown on a Friday to sundown on a Saturday. For most Christians, Sabbath is observed on a Sunday. That's what a lot of people do. But actually, again, Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath. We need, with the way that people work and working patterns these days, it might not be on a Sunday for you. It's not on a Sunday for me. It's a working day. So we celebrate Sabbath on a Friday, from normally when the kids are in school, when they get home from school for 24 hours through to that same point on a Saturday. But I would encourage people to have a set time each week, unless you work in shifts and that's not possible, but to have a time when this is our Sabbath to celebrate.
And that's something that we do as a family, isn't it?
Yeah.
So should we consider what our Sabbaths could look like? It's a day without work, a day for rest, a day that's made for us. It's a day to honour and worship God. So should we take each one in turn?
Yeah.
So a day without work.
Yes. So on the face of it, very simple. A day where we don't work, but it's no work, whether it's paid or voluntary. So for those of you who are in work where you get emails at home, particularly people working at home at the moment, this is a real challenge. This is a chance for us to make a difference. I don't know if people are having that experience of feeling like every day is the same at the moment. If you're in your home all the time, working from home, there's no rhythm to it. Sabbath is a brilliant way to break that. So it's on a Sabbath day, we don't check emails, we don't answer work calls. We set boundaries with the people in our work to make it clear this is not a day where I am available to you, where I'm going to be doing any work. And for some of us, that requires some real determination to set that principle in place. And, because as amazing as you are to your workplace, you're not that important that you have to be there 7 days a week.
Yeah. But there's a big difference between a day off and a Sabbath. Because on a day off, we'll fill it with other types of work, won't we? Housework, DIY. I've got a list for you this week.
Yeah.
Shopping. But Sabbath's about resting from that sort of work too, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is the key, that so often we have a day off and so we're like, oh, we'll just do all the house stuff that we've not got around to doing. But actually it's about creating a space where we don't do that work either, which means planning ahead.
Yeah.
This is something that we've learned, that we have to work out as we build up to our Sabbath. How do we make sure the house is tidy enough for us to be able to enjoy Sabbath? How do we make sure that we've got scheduled our shopping so we've got enough food in?
Yeah.
So it is about planning to say, this is going to be our day where we're not going to do the DIY and housework. Yeah. That's already done. And even if it's not done, we choose to say it's done for today.
Yeah, so for us, Friday is a busier day, like for me, trying to get all the washing done, run the dishwasher, empty the dishwasher, kind of for both of us just before Sabbath, tidying around to make sure that that's all done. Obviously, we still do the stuff for the kids, and so you can't take time off from that, but from running the machines, I always say, don't run any machines.
Again, we can become legalistic and say, oh, you ate a bit of grain, you ate 3 donuts or whatever it is.
I wish.
But that's actually a good point. So we one of the other things that we do is we take a rest from our diets or our nutrition plan or whatever you describe it as. Yeah. So we enjoy good food. On a Sabbath, I'll have a glass of beer or a whiskey and eat a lot more cake and chocolate than we would do throughout the week. So it's a day to really celebrate and to enjoy in that sense. And so that's it's hard work to keep up a healthy regime, and actually it's good to be able to say this is a day where we can just enjoy.
Yeah, and make your own traditions with that. So we make pancakes, but whatever kind of works for you. And our kids know what it means to start Sabbath, and to have that time together, don't they? Yeah.
So it's when we say to them it's going to be Sabbath today because we start partway through Friday, we say, wake up on a Friday, it's Sabbath later today, and they're like, yes, it's Sabbath. So
excited, what about a day of rest? Because rest is different to different people. Like me and you, we rest very differently, don't we?
Yeah, so for some people, going for a run, for example, would be
Yeah.
the last thing you would ever
Oh,
possibly
yeah.
consider doing on Sabbath. Whereas for me, that's really restful. That's a really enjoyable, life-giving activity. So rest does mean different things to different people, and you embrace what is restful for you. I would encourage some people that actually it's a day for being creative. But be careful with that, because if your job is in creative work, or if we shouldn't feel the need to have to produce anything and to like achieve anything, but if you enjoy playing music or doing painting or whatever,
Jigsaws, like a jigsaw.
Yeah, if you enjoy that stuff and that's restful and life-giving, then use it. If doing jigsaw is a stressful idea to you, don't include it in your Sabbath. Whatever you do, so it'll be different for each person.
Yeah,
and we have to compromise on that, because if you're in a family.
Yeah.
So there's an element of give and take. We have to love each other and be generous to each other.
I let you go for a run, but I don't go with you.
Perfect example.
Yeah. And finally, it's a day to honour God.
Yes. So the danger of Sabbath, or one of the dangers of Sabbath, is that it becomes a rest away from God. That we choose to sort of not pick up our Bibles, but actually it's a day where we open our Bibles together or alone. We pray. We keep our routines of connection with God. We spend more time with Him throughout the day, and so I want to encourage you to use it as a day to be thankful, to be grateful to God, because ultimately it's a day to honour Him. And so it's not just about I get to do what I want to do. But I
get to eat 3 donuts.
But we're resting, but we're giving glory to God in all that we do. So we start the day with Him, we spend the day with Him, and we finish the day with Him.
That's great.
Great. So that is the end of our podcast for today. I can't believe this is episode 7.
You've not put on here what's next week.
No, I haven't. So next week, episode 8, we're going to be thinking about self-care. Okay, and we're going to focus, I think, this for next week's episode, particularly on our mental health. But we're going to talk about why caring for ourselves is an important part of our relationship with God. Being rooted in Christ requires us to look after ourselves. So that should be really worth listening to, I hope.
Great.
Great. See you next time.
Bye.